Hi everyone, welcome back to my channel, or welcome if you guys are new. As I'm sure you can tell by the title, today's video is going to be a first impressions review, some swatches, a couple of looks, and a lot of comparisons on the new NATASHA DENONA I Need a Nude eyeshadow palette. I'm sure that there's a pretty good chance this is not the first video review that you've seen of this palette, but if it is, I'm going to go ahead and give you guys some overview of the palette, some details, things like that, and then I'm going to walk through lots of different things. So if you're not familiar with the feature called timestamp, you can look on the bar where you can scroll across my video, and as you scroll across it, you will see different titles. So if you're only here for a particular reason or something that you want to see, if you already know all the details about the palette and you want to skip through that section, feel free to use that timestamp feature and you will be able to go to exactly what you're looking for. But I hope that you'll watch all of the sections because I'm really excited about this video and I'm sure that you guys are too, which is probably why you've clicked on it. So let's jump into it. I want to go ahead and give you guys an overview of the palette. So here's a look at the carton that the package comes in. It's very plain and simple. On the back here, you do have the shade names and the ingredients of all of the shades. And then it does have a 24-month shelf life here, which you can see. But I do really like that it has all of the ingredients on the packaging. I feel like that's really helpful, especially if you're allergic to a type of ingredient. That's enough about the outer packaging. Let's take a look at the actual palette itself. So this is what the palette looks like. This is the front of the palette, of course. It's got those same sort of shapes on it. I think the packaging is a little bit odd. Like, I just don't understand like what the shapes are for, but it does make it slightly more interesting. Something I want to note about the packaging, which if you're not familiar with NATASHA DENONA palettes, you can pop the shades out and then like rearrange them. So this is one of her midi palettes. It retails for $69. So if you purchase another midi palette, you can swap out the shadows. So if you have a palette like the NATASHA DENONA Glam palette, again, you can pop these out and then you can rearrange them however you like. I think that that's really cool. I use the most random things to pop these out, but it's very nice that you have that option. And then on the back of the palette, also it does have a little sticker with a little bit more information. So I'll put that here so that hopefully you can see it, but just a little bit of standard information. But of course, most of that information is on the carton, which I don't usually keep. So just a note there. But something I wanted to note about this packaging is that it has this little like cover on it. So this is attached, it's, you know, part of the packaging for the overall look of it, but it does make it slightly thicker than her other palettes. I haven't heard anyone mention that in the reviews that I've watched, but I did want to point that out. So here it is compared to the Glam palette. You can see that the Glam palette does not have that little addition of this tiny little layer on it. So I just wanted to point that out. It's just like a hair thicker, but it is a little bit thicker than her other palettes. And then taking a look inside the actual palette, here is a closer look at that. You have got 8 shimmer shades of various shimmer type formulas and 7 matte shades. A very well-rounded ratio in my opinion. I definitely prefer more shimmers than mattes, but there has been some talk about the versatility of this palette and the inclusivity, so we will definitely touch on that later. But here is an overview of the inside of the palette. And then of course it does have quite a large mirror, as all of her palettes do. What I want to note the most is just the new formula that's shown in 3 of the shades in here, which are in Delilah, Sheen, and Mia. These are a wet looking formula, so I wanted to mention those because I want to pay a little bit closer attention on the swatches of how those look, but this has a ton of different textures in it, so I'm just going to refer you to this. Feel free to pause the screen so that you can see which type of formula each shadow is, but for me, I'm not really concerned with what the shadow formula is called versus what it looks like. So it's not as exciting to me. I'm gonna kind of like gloss past it just a little bit, but yeah, there are 3 shades that are in a new formula to NATASHA DENONA. So like I mentioned, this palette does retail for $69. You can purchase this from Sephora, from NATASHA DENONA's website, which is where I purchased it, or you can purchase it from Ulta now. They're now sold at Ulta, which is really great because in my opinion, and I feel like a lot of people's opinion, Ulta has the best point system. So I wanted to just talk a little bit about the ordering and the launch of this palette because personally I was pretty disappointed in it. I don't know how many people share this sentiment, so I won't spend too long talking about it, but I did want to mention it. So personally, I don't feel like Sephora has a good point system at all. And then this time around, when they launched this palette, they said that it was going to launch at Sephora and then the next day it was going to launch from Natasha Denona's website. So I figured I was going to purchase it from Sephora's website. Then on the launch day, I went to look at it and it wasn't available. You could only purchase this palette if you were a Rouge member. It said that it would be available for everyone else the following day, the day that it launched on Natasha Denona's website. So I looked first thing that morning. I was waiting for it to become available on either one. I did end up finding a countdown that this was going to launch, I think at like 11 a.m. From Natasha Denona's website. So around 11, I checked back on Sephora. No, it was still only available to Rouge members. And I'm not a Rouge member. I am like the middle tier, I guess like a VIB member or something. So I could not purchase it yet. And I just felt like that was really frustrating because nowhere did I see that it was only for Rouge until the day that it launched for Rouge. So then we're on the next day. It launches at Natasha Denona's website. So I'm looking on Sephora and it's not available. It's not available. It's not available. I forgot that it was sold at Ulta actually, and so I ended up picking mine up from Natasha Denona's website. I did use a coupon code. I used Morgan Turner's coupon code for 15% off, but there's a lot of creators that have coupon codes for them. I know that Morgan Turner, Lauren May Beauty, and Martina Lily all have coupon codes. I purchased mine from Natasha Denona. That whole day when it was supposed to be released to everyone else on Sephora, I personally did not see it available. Every time I checked throughout that day, it still said just to Rouge. So I felt that that was extremely frustrating. I do not like that Sephora did that. It really turns me off from purchasing anything from Sephora when I have the option to purchase it elsewhere, because I already feel like their point system and their sales are kind of lackluster for me. I just don't really enjoy them, but I probably would have considered picking this up from Ulta had I remembered that it was available there. But sometimes Ulta shipping takes a little bit longer, so I'm really glad that I picked mine up from Natasha Denona. So just wanted to mention that. I did want to also note the last thing about purchasing is that if you purchase it on Ulta, some of the coupons are excluded on this palette. So I had like a $10 off $40 purchase and I could not use it on this one. I did try and add it to my cart just to see if it would have worked, and it would not. So something to take note of if you're trying to purchase from Natasha Denona on Ulta's website. So, okay, that's kind of my spiel about purchasing and how my experience went. I just really don't like that Sephora did that. That leads me to not want to purchase from that retailer when possible. So next up, I want to show you guys swatches. So I did do swatches inside, outside, with the flash on, with the flash off. So I'm just going to go ahead and show you guys all of the different swatches while I kind of tell you about them. I did want to note that the swatches were very pretty and I really liked how they look on the arm. I did have to build up a couple of shades. The swatches that I did for this palette are not one swipe swatches by any means. I did want to build them up to show the true full potential of each color. So the two shades that I really felt like were more sheer than the other ones were the shades Vague and Tender. They were just a little bit more on the sheer side. Vague, I feel like it might have just had a little bit of a film on top, because it seemed like when I started to build it built up very quickly. So I do feel like it could have just been a film on it, but it was the first time I had dipped into swatch the shade. And then the shade Tender was pretty sheer even as I built it up, which I think could translate really well to the eyes, and how a palette swatches on your arm is not always cohesive or the same as how it's going to look on the eyes. So I just wanted to mention that. Of course, those are two matte shades, so I honestly don't mind how the swatches look usually on those. I'm more looking at the swatches for shimmer shades, to be honest, because they're prettier to me, but I did want to note that those were a little bit more sheer. So as I was watching the new formula, which is again the shades Delilah, Sheen, and Mia, I felt like these were a bit of a cross between like a Super Shock shadow and potentially the shimmers from the Kathleen Lights Disco Fox palette with Il Makiage, but I will show you guys in the comparison of those two palettes that they're really not very similar. So I would say that this is slightly more similar to, or a lot more similar to, a Super Shock shadow, but it's slightly reminiscent of those in the way that it actually feels. It's not as squishy as a Super Shock to the touch, but as far as the swatch and how it translated on the arm at least, I felt like it looked very similar to a Super Shock shadow from ColourPop. So hopefully that helps on the texture of the new one if you guys are familiar with either one of those formulas. That is what I wanted to mention about the swatches, and so I hope that seeing the swatches in different lighting was helpful for you all. I also have a very fair skin tone, and so hopefully if you guys have a skin tone similar to mine, you can get an idea as to what these particular shadows are going to look like on your skin tone. For comparisons, let's start out with other NATASHA DENONA palettes. Okay, so here are the comparisons between the My Dream palette on the left and of course the I Need a Nude palette on the right. So here's the palettes side by side. They are a little bit similar in a couple of the more taupey shades from the My Dream palette, but overall I think that they're pretty different still, especially because the My Dream leans a lot more purpley peachy. Okay, so here are the swatch comparisons between the two palettes. So the My Dream is on the bottom and the I Need a Nude is on the top. So there's definitely a couple of shades that are slightly similar, especially like these more taupey matte shades. This peachy sort of a shade here is pretty similar, but honestly, outside of that, I would say that they're pretty dang different. Of course, these more like neutral tone shimmers are gonna be a little bit similar, but I honestly still think that they're different enough. But here is another kind of more still look at those two in comparison to one another. Okay, here's the mini Starlette palette in comparison with the I Need a Nude palette. This one surprises me, honestly, as to how similar it is. You guys are gonna have to let me know what you think about this, but outside of this shade here, I feel like all four of these look like they could have come from the I Need a Nude palette. So I am very surprised that these two launched so closely together, because I just reviewed this mini Starlette palette a couple of weeks ago on my channel, and I'm surprised that these were launched back to back like that. They're very, very similar. I feel like you'll probably agree that if these two palettes were launched in reverse order and you had picked up the I Need a Nude and then the mini Starlette palette was released, you wouldn't have picked it up. So they were very smart to release the mini palette first, in my opinion. But yeah, I think these are super similar. What do you guys think about these? Okay, next up has to be the most awaited comparison, is the Glam palette in comparison, of course, to the I Need a Nude. I see what people are saying about these being similar, but to me, it just like honestly wasn't a concern, because I love the Glam palette so much that I'm happy to have what I see as an extension to the palette, and I'm excited to mix the two palettes. I love that the I Need a Nude has a lighter background, and I'm interested to see if I were to swap this palette into a black background, what it would look like. So I'm actually going to do that for you guys, and I will insert that now. I think it was really smart that NATASHA put this in a palette with lighter, like a lighter background behind the shades, because look at it compared to Glam now. I mean, these look a lot more similar now than they did in the lighter background. Of course, the Glam palette has the black background with even like a little lighter edge there, but they definitely look a lot more similar with the black background, in my opinion. So I do feel like that really did help with them looking different. I still think that the swatches speak for themselves and you can see the differences for sure, but I definitely think NATASHA and her team were really smart to put that one in the lighter packaging, because this definitely gave a different look than the black background. I feel like the two of these palettes are like the perfect companion palettes to one another, and I think it shows in the swatches. So here are the swatches for those two. Again, I Need a Nude, of course, is on top. I'm not changing those swatches out every time, and then the Glam palette's on the bottom. So to me, it makes the Glam palette look a lot more glam. I feel like the I Need a Nude palette looks a little bit more soft and girly and sparkly, whereas these shimmers, especially in the Glam palette, are a lot more metallic. The new palette has a ton more formulas in it and different finishes, which I really appreciate and I'm excited to put on the eyes. But to me, honestly, these are very different. So I do not think that they are dupes for one another. I really don't think that they have too many overlapping shades. And the shades that do overlap, I don't see a problem in it, because a lot of them have different finishes. So I am super happy to have both of these in my collection. And I don't necessarily think that if you have one, you don't need the other one. Granted, of course, you don't need it, but I do think that they go very well together. I also see myself creating a nice custom palette for myself out of these, and probably a couple from the My Dream palette as well. But yeah, I really love the two of these swatched next to each other. This has me more excited for the palette than I even was when I first got it. Okay, I decided to kind of go all out with these comparisons. So these are going to start the comparisons to non-NATASHA DENONA palettes. We're going to start out with the Makiage and Kathleen Light's Disco Fox palette. The new formulas from the NATASHA DENONA palette, called Delilah, Sheen, and Mia, felt pretty similar to me to the Kathleen Light's ones, these more glitzy sort of shades. So I really wanted to compare them, not only for some of the colors, but really for the formula, because as I mentioned with these in the swatches, these new formulas to me feel like a mixture of a ColourPop Super Shock and this shimmer formula from Kathleen Lights and Il Makiage. So let me show you the swatches. So here's the swatches of how those compare. I was just going to compare the shimmer shades, but then I started looking at the mattes and I decided to swatch the whole palette. So the Kathleen Lights one is not in the order of the palette, so you'll have to excuse that. But I think that you guys can still get a good idea of these. So to me, the new formulas are very glittery like that, but they're definitely not as chunky as the Disco Fox ones. So the texture feels similar, but the one from Il Makiage and Kathleen Lights are just a little bit more kind of chunky. But I would say that the Reflect is actually a little bit more similar to a Super Shock shadow. So hopefully that helps. While we're on the topic of Super Shocks, I do have one in my collection. This is called I Heart This, and I do want to show you guys what this formula looks like in comparison. This is a lot more similar to the shade called Mia here in texture and formula. So I do feel like the Super Shock shadow is the best comparison to NATASHA's new formula, at least from what I have in my collection. But here's one last look at how those two palettes, the Il Makiage and Kathleen Lights Disco Fox palette and the NATASHA DENONA My Dream palette, with not including this because that's the Super Shock. Okay, next to last palette comparison, this is the ColourPop That's Taupe palette. I really wanted to swatch this one because it's another cool tone palette in my collection, but I do feel like this one compares more to the Glam palette than this one, but I did want to go ahead and show you guys the swatches. So here are those swatches. I actually do feel like this one is more similar than the Glam palette to the I Need a Nude palette, minus the couple of more warm tone shades like the peachy colors, but I definitely feel like you could get a look very similar to the I Need a Nude palettes. I'm actually really glad that I did swatch this one, but I still think that it compares more to the Glam palette because it does lack some of those slightly more warm shades. But there's the swatches for those two. Okay, the last set of comparisons is to the Moira Chasing Eternity palette. This one is a little bit more warm tone, but I did feel like a couple of the shades sort of overlapped. This is a much more affordable palette, so I thought I'd go ahead and show the swatches on this one too. But here are the swatch comparisons to that. I honestly don't feel like these are very similar at all. If we're talking about one or two shades that overlap, I feel like that's just so common for a neutral palette. It's kind of impossible to avoid. So I'm not gonna spend too much time on this one. I feel like it's pretty different. And while the Moira one is more neutral in my experience, it does lean a lot more warm tone than the NATASHA DENONA one. So that's gonna be the last set of swatches that I'm going to do for comparisons. When I first saw this palette come out, and I saw some of the looks that NATASHA created, it reminded me of this one. So I went and pulled this out of my makeup memory box. I do not use this on my eyes still, do not worry. I got this when it first came out, but this is the Urban Decay Naked 2 palette. And some of the smoky eyes that NATASHA was creating really reminded me of this, and this was a favorite palette of mine. You guys can see I had some pans in this. So I really want to do some more like sultry type glam looks that would be a little bit reminiscent of this. I'm not gonna bother swatching these next to each other, honestly, because I forgot to do it when I did all the swatches, but looking at them, they're really not that similar. This one's probably closer to Glam again, but the looks that NATASHA created really reminded me of this, and that sparked something in me that I cannot explain because this was my first high-end palette ever. I loved this. My brother bought this for me for Christmas, and yeah, this is just like one of my all-time favorite palettes. This is one of the ones that got me into makeup. I was such a cool tone little kid. When I was 16, this is what I wore, and I loved this palette. So honestly, it was just fun just to even be reminded by it and bring it back out. So I put some polls on my Instagram to see what you guys wanted to see. A lot of you suggested, or requested rather, the swatches and comparisons, and so I hope that those were very helpful for you all. And I'm also going to be creating some looks, but I wanted to go ahead and just kind of go through your responses and address any that I could now, and then hopefully all the rest of them will be answered throughout the rest of this. A lot of you guys wanted to see swatches, comparisons, first impressions, and I had a lot of requests for everyday looks. A lot of you wanted to see looks with this palette, which makes sense. So I will be doing that, but I wanted to just go ahead and kind of walk through a couple that you guys asked. So Simply Stacy asked could I compare Ella to Filigree and Muse to Travertine? So I'm gonna go ahead and show you guys that because they are, you know, pretty similar looking. So Ella to Filigree first, let's see. So Ella is this shade here on the top row, and then Filigree is here on the second row. So I'm gonna go ahead and show you guys how those compare. Ella actually swatches a lot lighter, if you guys can see. Ella is a lot more sheer and a little bit lighter than Filigree, so I will show you guys those swatches and hopefully that will help you guys. So here is Ella. I'm just gonna do a one finger swipe so you guys can see. And then here is Filigree. These are not my best swatches. I will go ahead and drag that one out a little bit. So these actually look pretty different. Filigree is much more pigmented, whereas Ella has a much more sheer base. And I was pleasantly surprised to see that they swatched rather differently. And then next up, Stacy asked about the shades Muse and Travertine. So these are two very different formulas, and I think that's gonna be the biggest difference here. So Muse is a little bit more of like, almost like a chunky shade. It definitely is more like a chunky glitter, but it's not like a pressed glitter. So here's the shade called Muse. This has got to be the most reflective, most glittery shade. And then this one is Travertine. So this one is much, much more sheer. Let me build that one up. I know I said these were going to be one swipe sort of ones, but okay, that's something I wanted to mention too. This formula that Travertine is, there is a formula like that in my Dream palette. Let me grab that one. And I do get hard pan in that shade. So this one here is called Babies, and this one does get a lot of hard pan. Hopefully you guys can see, but I had to kind of scrape that one off recently, and then just from doing the swatch comparisons today, it already has hard pan in it again. So it is definitely more of like an oily texture. And this one, just from swatching this a couple of times, does already have a little bit of hard pan. Well, I don't know. Whisper feels slightly similar to it, but it doesn't seem to get hard pan like Travertine, so I did want to mention that, but I'm going to try and build that one up. This one might be a shade I need to try with a brush, because maybe it's just using your finger that makes this one have hard pan, but it's really pretty. So I'm just gonna build this up a little bit so you can actually see the comparisons. These are a little bit more similar than the last two, but like I said, it's the texture that's gonna be really different on these. So as a reminder, these are the shades Muse up top and Travertine right below. Hopefully that helps you out, Stacy. And I'm sure a lot of other people were wondering about that too. So hopefully that can give you guys some reference on how they compare. So some of you guys asked for specific comparisons to palettes that I don't have, so I'm very sorry about that. I hope that you guys can find those comparisons in other videos. I compared all of the palettes that I felt like in my collection were similar enough, so I'm hoping that that's helpful for you all, but there's a lot of them I don't have, like the Sultry palette, the Go in Coconuts. I don't have those, unfortunately. Okay, another comment about the dark shimmer shades that look pretty similar and that the palette could have had more diverse mattes. My thoughts on this, and I think I'll share this a little bit more at the end of this video, but if I forget, I do agree with you. However, upon swatching these shades, I do feel like they do swatch different enough. Like the perfect example would be how Ella and Filigree swatch differently, and then even Travertine. So let me show you those all next to each other. Also, these are the three, oh, and Delilah, I'll show you that one too. So here's the four kind of deep looking shimmers actually on the finger. These first two are actually a little bit lighter than I would have thought, so they don't swatch as similarly as I would have thought that they would, but I definitely do think there's a little bit of overlap. So I honestly do feel like these swatch differently enough, because even on the finger, the bottom two looked similar, but on the swatches, they are different. And again, you're gonna get down to those texture differences. All of these feel like different formulas from one another. And I feel like that's where you're getting the differences here. And I really appreciate that in a neutral palette, because when you have tones that are similar to one another, if they have different textures or different formulas, I feel like they really can provide a different look on the lid. So what I wish NATASHA Denona would have done is take a page out of Sydney Grace's book and release two palettes. I think that that was really warranted in this palette, and I think it's really warranted in most palettes, with the exception of like a rainbow palette. But I think it's really warranted in any neutral kind of everyday sort of a palette. Not that a rainbow palette can't be, you know, everyday, but I'm talking about like neutrals that, you know, a lot of people would consider an everyday palette. I just feel like they could have released 2. Sydney Grace releases usually 2 palettes per launch. They have a lighter version and a deeper version. A lot of times they're only switching out a handful of shades, and I feel like NATASHA DENONA can handle that. You know, they have shades that pop out anyway, so they wouldn't even have to use different packaging. They don't glue in their shades, so I feel like it'd be pretty simple, and they could have deepened up a lot of these matte shades, maybe added even a matte black or something. I feel like they could have just made it a little bit different. I think that that was warranted, but for me, I do have fair skin, so I do prefer a lighter palette, so it does work for me. However, I do wonder, and I know this is a common thought right now, how this would work for someone with deeper skin. So I really do feel like they should have launched 2. That's kind of my opinion on this. I think that that would have been very appropriate and very understandable because of how the palette is set up. So that's what I wish that they would have done. Let me know what you guys think down in the comments though, as far as like how the color story looks. I feel like that's a pretty common feeling right now about the shimmers and how you could have had more diverse mattes. I totally see where you're coming from. And I know not everyone shares my preference. I feel like I just really like a lighter palette. So I also asked you guys if you wanted to see just arm swatches or eye and arm swatches. And for a while there, you guys were just saying arm swatches, but at the end, it ended up being 70% that an eye swatch would help you guys out. Now, I don't want to just totally obliterate my eyelids. So what I'm going to do is swatch the shimmer shades all over my eyes so you guys can see those. And then I did ask later on if there were any particular shades that you guys wanted to see. One of you guys said you wanted to see the shade Vague, so I will do a swatch of that one. And I think everything else should be covered with the shimmer shades of the ones you guys were hoping to look at. Going through the rest of the polls so that I can kind of have that all in one chapter on the timeline there. I asked what kind of looks you guys wanted to see most, and you voted for one everyday look and one ethereal or glittery look. I was hoping you guys would pick that one, so I'm really glad that you did. Okay, so let's go ahead and jump in with the swatches. I am going to go a little bit out of order. I want to put some that look a little bit similar next to each other on the eyes. So we will start out with the wet formula, and then we'll work our way towards some of the deeper shimmer shades. I'm just gonna swatch them with my fingers because I feel like it'll be the most opaque that way. I'm finally gonna take this off the mirror so that I can see the swatches that I'm doing, and that's always just like the best part. Okay, so let's jump in with the swatches. I want to start out with the shades Sheen and Mia. These are the 2 shades on the bottom row, and these have the new wet look formula. So let's go ahead and just try that out. I'm going to speed up actually putting them on, but I'm going to build them up to show hopefully some full opacity of what the shadow has. So hopefully you guys can see, but I'm starting with Sheen. And then I'm going to put Mia on the other eye, which this is the shade I was the most drawn to in this palette. And a lot of you guys said that you wanted to see this one. Oh my goodness. Okay, so these are like single shadows to me. These feel like Super Shocks for sure. They look like Super Shocks, and I think that they're gorgeous. I am interested to see if any of these shades crease on me, because I did have a little bit of creasing with the My Dream palette. I'll build this up a little bit more. I'm just putting this on over concealer and powder, so there's no eyeshadow primer or anything underneath. Okay, so here are the shades Sheen and Mia. So I'll give you guys a closer look. Yeah, these are really pretty, just like a Super Shock shade. I really like them. Okay, this is the part of the video where my eyes are about to take a little bit of a hit, but hopefully they won't be too bad. Okay, next up is going to be the shade Ella on this eye. That's actually really pretty all over the lid. See, these swatches are actually kind of fun. I feel like I need to do these more because I typically wouldn't put this shadow all over the lid. Okay, and then on the other eye is going to be Delilah, which is the last wet look formula that I have yet to swatch. Again, very Super Shock-esque. Okay, so these are actually pretty similar in my opinion on the eyes. So Ella is a little bit more kind of grungy looking. It's not as sparkly or glimmery as Delilah is, but the base of them is pretty similar. Delilah has a silver and gold reflect in it, whereas Ella really just has kind of a bronzy sort of a flip to it from what I'm seeing. So here's a closer look again of Ella and Delilah. Okay, next up, let's look at the shades Whisper and Muse. So I'm gonna do Whisper on this eye. These are not really similar to one another, but they're also not similar to anything else in the palette. So I'm gonna just put them side by side. This is gonna be my inner corner highlight shade, I can already tell. I'm actually gonna pop a little bit on the inner corner because I wanna see it. Yeah, this is definitely like nice inner corner highlight type shade. And then Muse, I'm excited to see this one. This is more glitzy, a little bit more chunky and glittery. Really, really pretty. Okay, very, very different finishes, but here is Whisper and Muse. This one does not feel chunky in the sense of like the actual glitter pieces I wanted to mention, the shade Muse. It doesn't feel like a pressed glitter per se. I would have to look at what the formula is listed as for that one, but I feel safe using it on the eyes personally. But of course, I know that people have different opinions about pressed glitter type shades, but to me, this one doesn't feel like a pressed glitter. I don't feel like it would hurt my eyes. But of course, use the shadows at, you know, your own discretion and what you feel comfortable with. Okay, the last two shimmers that we need to swatch on the eyes are Travertine and Filigree. We have compared these a little bit, but I want to put them on the eye. So this is Travertine first, and it definitely has some hard pan. I want to swatch it. I want to swatch it with a finger still since I'm doing that on the other ones, but I'm going to try and scrape off the hard pan. I don't like that it gets that, but that's okay. So here is a Filigree. This one kind of feels like, well, I don't know. To me, this one looks like it's one of the wet shades. It doesn't feel like the same formula, but it definitely does feel like a type of Super Shock. I don't know. It does feel slightly different though when you actually are picking it up in the palette. But these are the last two shimmer shades. Like I mentioned, the swatches are a little messy, but I hope you guys can still get an idea. So here is Travertine and Filigree. For the matte shades, I'm going to use a brush because that's how I typically would apply a matte shade, but I will build it up. So one of you guys wanted to see the shade Vague. So I'm going to start out with that one, and I'm going to put that on my left eye. But I'm going to just pack this on so that you guys can get a feel for how this shade looks. I'm going to try and test the blending more when I actually create looks, so don't look too closely at the edges. This is just to give you an idea of the color payoff. And this is a clean brush, so the color is true to NATASHA DENONA's Vague shade. It's not mixed with anything else. So here's a look at that. All right, I'm gonna make sure there's nothing else you guys wanted to see. One of you said the two pinks on the bottom row. I can't tell if you were talking about the two shimmers or the shade Wit. I've already shown you Sheen, so I'm gonna go ahead and show the shade Wit. And again, I'm gonna pack this all over the lid. Okay, so these are the two peachier type shades. You can see that they're very different on the lid. They're slightly patchy because I'm just really trying to show you the color payoff. So I think I might actually try and build them up with my finger on top just so that they're a little bit more crisp looking. So let's see if that helps. But I typically would blend them a lot more if I was actually trying to create a look. But here's two matte shades. So this is Vague and Wit again. Okay, the two that I want to see compared to one another are Stone and Mesh. I think that they look pretty similar in the pans at least. So that's this one here and this one here. So I'm going to start out with the shade Stone on this eye. This is a really pretty, like a dusty, purpley gray type of shade. I think this would be really pretty smoked out. And then let's do the shade Mesh. I feel like this would be like a really fun one and done type of shade. And Mesh is definitely lighter than Stone, but they're pretty similar. I feel like if you used a light hand with Stone, you would get it to look like this. So this to me so far is the most repetitive two shades that I've seen in the palette. I'm gonna build the shade Mesh up on this eye. I just wanna see how deep it would build up. And then I'll do the same for Stone with the finger as well. Those are different, but not very different. So to me, so far, those are the most repetitive shades in the palette. Let's create the looks. I'm dying to do that, especially now that I've done some eye swatches. Okay, I know this is a long video, but let's do it. So we talked about an everyday look and a kind of glam, glitzy sort of a look. So we're gonna go for glittery or ethereal, and then everyday. I also had a request to show how to use some of the deeper shades in an everyday look, because you mostly do everyday looks, but this does have quite a few deeper shimmer shades. So I'm gonna start out with an everyday look, and then I'm going to add a deeper shimmer shade to show you all how I would use it for an everyday type of look, to be able to use all of the shades in the palette however you might want to. All right, let's jump in. So we're gonna start out with the everyday look. I'm going to start out with the shade called Fair, which is probably the shade I'll start out every single look with this palette that I ever create. I'm gonna tap the brush off. I tap my brush off so that I can start out with a lighter layer and build up as I want to, but I know some people don't do that, but for me, I've got fair skin, I've got to build my shades up. So far, this one looks pretty similar to my skin tone. I feel like I could use this as a powder. This is going on top of a concealer base that was pressed down with a pressed powder. I don't have any eyeshadow primer on. I'm not gonna add any glitter glue, just so that you know. My eyes also probably look a little bit rough now because I did just do about 10 eye swatches on my eyes. So next I wanna go in on the same fluffy brush with the shade Mesh. These lighter shades, the matte ones, do have some kick up in the pan, just to note that. I want to also blend this in the crease, and this is going to be my transition shade. I just love putting that shade Fair down because I feel like it helps everything blend nicer. It also helps it blend a little bit more seamlessly into my brow. Okay, next up with a slightly smaller fluffy brush, I'm going to go in with the shade Wit. I do want to use these kind of peachier shades. So in this one, I'm just going to use a lighter peachy shade. I want to use this on the inner portion of the crease. I did tap the brush off, and I'm kind of using a light hand with this. And then with the same brush, I want to dip in to that same shade Wit, and then just a tiny little bit of Vague, and I'm going to tap the brush off again because I want this to be everyday. This is my version of everyday, what I might wear to work. And I don't want it to be like super bold. I'm just gonna kind of blend that mostly on the outer portion of the crease, and I'm gonna blend it in just a little bit once most of it's gone. I'm also gonna pick up that shade Wit, pinch the brush, and run that on the lower lash line. These are blending as expected for NATASHA DENONA. Her shadows blend very well in my experience. I have no complaints so far with that. I'm gonna pick up a little bit of the shade Stone with the first brush that I used. I wanna bring in some more of that kind of cool tone look. I'm gonna put that on top of the more peachy shades, and I just kind of wanna see like if I blended them, how they would look, honestly. And I'm also gonna pinch that brush and run that on the lower lash line once most of the pigment is off. So I just kind of wanna go for a little bit of a mixed look with the cool tones and the peachy tones. Just kind of switch it up. That's about as deep as I will probably do for an everyday look. So I'm not gonna add any deeper shades. There's a lot of videos where people are adding the deeper shade, the silhouette color, because everyone wants to know how deep the palette can get. So if you're looking for that, I would suggest trying another video because I don't want to do the same thing that everyone else is doing. I don't find that that would be very helpful. I do want to try and use several shades. So where I might typically would only dip into one, I'm also going to take 2 shimmer shades. So I'm going to start out with the shade Ella, and then I'm going to follow it up with Travertine. So Ella, I'm going to put in the center of the lid. I'm just going to kind of tap that. And then I'm going to pick up the shade Travertine and put that on the inner portion of the lid. Those definitely have different textures. Ella is slightly more glittery. It's not glittery, it's just slightly more glittery than Travertine. And then let's see. On a small pencil brush, I do want to pick up the shade Whisper. This is the one that I mentioned would be my inner corner highlight shade here. And for sure, I had to put that on the inner corner here. So I'm gonna do that. And then I think it's gonna be just a little fun just to kind of pull this up. Allie Glines does this a lot, and I really love how it looks on her. So this is definitely something that I've picked up over the years from her. And she calls it her scoopity boopity. And I'm gonna pull this on the brow bone as well as a brow highlight. And honestly, I think that this is a really pretty everyday look. So what I'm gonna say is that this would be like look number 1. So I'm kind of giving you guys 3 looks. I'm gonna build on this one a little bit. I still would consider what I'm gonna do an everyday, but what I want to do is add a little extra to it. So I'm gonna add the shade Sheen. I'm gonna pick that up with my finger, and I'm gonna just lightly tap that all over the lid. Just gonna add a little bit of something extra, a little bit of that kind of reflective, wet, super shock type look. Again, this is one of those new wet formulas, and I feel like it just adds a really pretty sheen to it, which the shade is called Sheen, so that works. That pun was not even intended. So then what I want to do is show you guys how I would use one of the deeper shimmer shades. And the way that I would do that is honestly just by creating a liner look with it. I think a shimmery liner can be really pretty. So I'm just going to use an angled brush. This is an eyebrow brush, but you can use an angled brush for anything. And I'm going to pick up the shade Filigree. Hopefully I've shown you guys that the deeper shimmer shades honestly do not look the same, but this is the deepest shimmer shade in the palette, so I'm going to use that just to show you guys. And what I'm going to do is just press this along the lash line, and it's not going to add a ton, but what it's going to add is just like a little bit of definition, but it's not going to be as harsh as a matte shade that's this depth, as if I were to take the shade Silhouette, the deepest matte in the palette. But it does add, and hopefully you guys can see on camera, it just adds like a little something. I'm not going to wing it out. I'm just going to press it as close to the lash line as I can. I am getting a little bit of fallout, so you could definitely wet the brush to do this. It's probably what I would do, but I didn't want to do that for this video. I want to just show how it truly is. That's the first bit of fallout I've gotten though. And that's how I would use a deep shimmer shade for an everyday look. It doesn't add too much, but just adds a little bit of definition without a liner. And like I said, with it being a shimmer shade, in my opinion, it just looks that much more subtle, because if you already wear a shimmer on the lid, it just looks like you almost have a matte liner and then you just put your shimmer shades on top. But you know that you did it, you know. And that'll also help you actually use the shades from the palette. So that's how I would create a nice everyday look with this palette. And then let's do the more like glitzy, glimmery, ethereal type look on this other eye. I'm gonna backtrack a little bit. I'm gonna go back over to this look and add the shade Wit back, which was the lighter peachy shade. I feel like I just covered that up a little bit more than I wanted to. And I kind of want to just add just a little bit back to the crease. Yeah, I really like that. And then I'm going to blend that out as well, just with a lighter, it's like fluffy brush again. This one doesn't have anything on it. So I feel like that's super, super pretty. And if you wanted it to be a little bit lighter, you just probably wouldn't add the shade Stone into the crease. But to me, that's a really pretty everyday look that I would feel confident wearing. Okay, back over to this eye. So I'm starting with totally new brushes. And I'm gonna start out with another fluffy kind of crease brush, and I'm gonna go into the shade Fair. Again, it's the one I mentioned I'll probably start every look ever with this palette. So I'm gonna put this everywhere. I always start out in the crease, and I'm even gonna bring it down on the lid. I'm gonna make sure to take it all the way to the brow, because you guys already know the glitter shades, the shimmers are going all the way up to the brow. Okay, so I've got the shade Fair everywhere, adding a little bit more of that so I have it in the brush. And then I'm gonna pick up the shade Mesh again. I wanna put this in the crease. And this is gonna be the last matte shade that I use for this look. Going back in with the shade Fair, I'm just gonna kind of go back and forth between the two, and then pick up a little bit more of Mesh, pinch the brush, and I'm gonna put this on the lower lash line. I do have a little bit of glitter on the lower lash line from the eye swatches, so that's what that's from. But it'll work in our favor because this is the ethereal eye. So I'm just running that shade Mesh, which is the kind of second lightest shimmer shade, all over. And that's everything I want for the matte shades. Now for the fun part. I think I'm gonna use my fingers for all of these shades. I'm gonna start out with the shade Mia, the prettiest shade ever. I'm going to put this on the inner corner, and then just the inner portion of the lid, and also the inner portion of the lower lash line. I'm going to blend this up into the crease area where my eye socket kind of goes in. I don't know if that even made sense. Next up, I'm gonna take the shade Muse, which is the nice shimmery, glittery type shade in the middle there. I'm gonna tap this on the middle of the lid. Again, bringing it up through the crease. This one is stunning. Just going to pack that on. I'm also going to put this on the lower lash line. I'm really just matching what I'm doing on the top lid. And then I'm gonna take the shade Delilah. So to point it out on the palette, start out with Mia, then Muse, and now I'm going in with the shade Delilah, which is the other wet shade. So Mia was the first, wet shade, and then we used Sheen on the other eye. So I wanted to go ahead and use all three of them. So this is going to be the outer corner shade. And again, all the way up to the brow. Very, very into that. I'm also gonna bring the shade Delilah in the crease just to kind of build up some depth here on top of the shade Muse, so that we have a little bit of dimension. Really like that. And then I will also, of course, match that on the lower lash line. I'm kind of being a little messy with it. I don't mind if I have some glitter fallout. If you do, then, maybe just do your eye makeup first, but I wanted to have my face makeup done before I started filming for time's sake, because this is already a very, very long video. And then with a pretty densely packed pencil brush, I'm gonna pick up the shade Filigree for this look too. And this time I want to pack the shade on the outer corner. Okay, I'm actually gonna pick up the shade Sheen for this look too. I wanna go over the shade Muse with this one just to kind of match some of the finishes together and make sure that they're going really well together. So I kind of put that in the middle and then brought it kind of at an angle towards the highest point of my brow. And then I think the last thing is gonna pick up more of the shade Mia and make sure that I didn't lose any of that. I'm gonna pick up more of the shade Mia, and I'm gonna use the brush to help put this on the lower lash line. And I'm gonna bring it down a little bit farther than I typically would too. I feel like it just goes with a nice glitter effect. I'm gonna pick up the shade Sheen, which is the one we used in the center there. It's the more wet formula. And then I'm gonna pick up the shade Delilah, the third wet formula. And I'm also gonna add that. Just make sure to blend them all together, using the same brush for all of that too. I definitely got more fallout using those shades on the lower lash line, but I think that's pretty typical for shimmers on the lower lash line. Okay, I wanna leave it just glittery like this. I don't even wanna add anything else. So the only other thing I'm gonna do is take the very first brush I used for this look and run that along the brow just to kind of help that. I lied. I want to take the shade Mia underneath this area as well. Just brighten that up a little closer to the nose. Last step, I'm just going to curl the lashes and add the Lottie London, what is this called? Super Fake Mascara to both eyes. Okay, I put 2 coats of mascara on the upper lashes on the left eye with the everyday type look, and then 3 coats of mascara on the more ethereal glittery look, and then just 1 coat of mascara on each of the lower lash lines. So these are going to be the finished looks for this video. I hope that you guys enjoy the looks that I created. I do feel like they're a little bit different than what I've been seeing in videos, which is what I was trying to go for, because I know that you guys are probably watching all of the other reviews, as am I. So hopefully these are a little bit different. I know a lot of people are saying you're gonna get the same looks out of this palette. I honestly feel like you can get a lot of different looks, especially because of the finishes. I mean, just look at the 2 different looks here as far as the finishes go. This one's a lot more satin, and then this one is obviously a lot more glittery, glam type thing, but you can also go really sultry. I mean, super neutral with like a one and done shadow look. So I honestly feel like they're pretty different, and I think I could see quite a few different looks. I'm excited to use some of the peachy shades, mostly just like a peachy look, and then maybe add either Mia or Sheen. I feel like that will be really nice, but that's it for the 2 looks that I'm gonna create. If there's anything that you guys want to see different, maybe like a more deep look with the silhouette shade on me, let me know. I will film that, but not in this video. I think this one's long enough. Okay, so let's talk final thoughts. I really like this one. I'm excited about it. I feel like with Natasha Denona palettes, I'm either over the moon excited to try it, or kind of like the Yucca palette. I thought, oh, it's so pretty, but it's just not me. But one thing I really appreciate is Natasha Denona's artistry. She's a makeup artist, and she's an amazing makeup artist. I love the looks that she creates, and I'm excited to recreate some of them with this palette. So I really love just scrolling through her Instagram. She is a creator that makes me feel so inspired. I really love her artistry. Her and Katie Jane Hughes are 2 of my very favorite makeup artists ever. I really just love how she does makeup. So final thoughts is good so far. Of course, this is just a first impression review. I have now swatched them, done the look. I feel like I have a pretty decent idea of this. It feels very standard to Natasha Denona's quality. It does feel very different in texture than the Glam palette though, which I'm really excited about. I do feel like this and the Glam palette, I feel like these are going to be amazing comparison palettes, and I am just excited to see how they look together. And then I do want to kind of create a custom palette mixing them with the My Dream palette, because now I do luckily have 3 of the midi size palettes. I don't see myself ever purchasing one of the full size ones. They're like $129 or something, and that's just a lot. So I'm excited to have another midi palette to be able to play around with and mix all the shades together. So that's kind of how I'm feeling about it. As far as building up depth, I don't think that this palette is that type of a palette. I do feel like it's going to be more of like a mid-tone sort of a look that you're going to get out of it. The silhouette shade, it doesn't look as deep as some of the looks that I've seen her create. I think that, I don't know, maybe she's like mixing some eyeliners with it or something to create a really, really deep look. On some of her models that she's like had the really sultry looks on, but to me, like that shade silhouette is deep enough because I do have really fair skin. But I just kind of go back to the idea that I wish that she would have launched a light version and a dark version similar to what Sydney Grace does, because I can see how this being the only like deeper shade would not really be ideal for a lot of people. But for me, I really am excited about it not being so deep. I really want to create more looks with this. I'm excited to use this on a daily basis as well, because I'm just excited about the formulas. I love how many formulas are in this one palette. I feel like it just feels very exclusive. I don't know if that makes sense. It feels very exclusive and high-end, very luxury. This feels like a very luxurious palette. Really love the color story. To me, this is more of like a true neutral palette. Definitely leans cool tone, but to me, this is a neutral palette, like a pretty middle of the road, but slightly cool tone. To me, this is not like 100% cool tone palette like I would consider the Glam palette to be. So those are kind of my final thoughts on it so far. I'm really enjoying it. I do feel like the shade Travertine is going to get on my nerves with the hard pan that it already has. That's not my favorite formula, but outside of that one, everything else seems to be really good. I'm not seeing hard pan. Well, actually, I see a little bit on the shade Whisper. I was afraid of that. So those 2 are going to end up kind of being my trouble troubled children, you know, but I don't really love that formula so much because of the hard pan, but I can get past it. And I still really like the palette. So I hope that you guys enjoyed today's video. If you did enjoy today's video, please go ahead and give it a thumbs up. It would mean a lot. I'm really working hard on my channel and especially on this video. This was a long one. So I hope that you guys got something out of it and that it was helpful for you. If there's anything else that you want to see regarding this palette, let me know down below. I would love to hear. I will definitely keep that in mind for future videos, as well as any other video suggestions or anything that you would like to see from my channel as a whole. If you do enjoy my content, I would love for you guys to subscribe, but that's all I got for you today. Thank you guys so much for watching, especially if you made it to the end of the video. Wow, thank you. I know this was a long one. I really appreciate you guys watching and taking the time out of your day to watch my video, but I will see you guys in the next one. Bye.